My family and I began our work here in Newburgh just under a year ago, and while 2020 has been one for the books, getting to know the congregation, the town, the community, and learning how best to serve all three has so far been a good use of our time and effort, and we've appreciated the opportunity. Even before this crazy year started, my family had been hanging out in limbo for quite a while. We spent 3 months in transition from our previous home, and this meant packing up our stuff and putting it in storage before loading up the bare essentials, leaving Nebraska, and living as guests in Illinois with comparatively very few possessions. That was a difficult time for us, but it was also a good lesson in contentment and making do. The house where we stayed in Illinois had an assortment of board games, and my 2 oldest boys learned how to play a few of them while we were there. One was the classic Game of Life. My oldest especially liked this game and developed a pretty greedy mentality while we played, since the person with the most money at the end of the game is the winner. As such, at each payday, he'd thrust his greedy little hand out and say some variation of, "Money, gimme!" When he managed to acquire the coveted yellow salary card, which ensures $100,000 of fake money every payday, he'd start proclaiming, "I'm rich," with great exuberance and satisfaction. When he was stuck with anything less, every ounce of his attention went into finagling away into the top salary. This wasn't a big surprise, because he was 5 years old at the time. But even we adults tend to behave that way, and we don't confine it to the game of life. Instead, we let it spill over into actual life. We generally know better, but it's still a struggle for most of us. As we enter the Christmas season, we're once again seeing all of the excesses, materialism, and greed front and center. It will continue that way for the next couple of months in the people around us, and perhaps in ourselves, even in a year like 2020. In 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 through 10, Paul tells Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. This passage puts me to shame nearly every time I read it, and it reminds me how truly rich I am. It reminds me that I focus on stuff far too much, and that Jesus taught us one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. That's Luke 12:15. The Apostle Paul was rich beyond imagination, but he was a humble tent maker. He left an astonishing impact on the world, but he had no permanent home on this earth. He accomplished more for Christ's kingdom than I ever will, but he was poor, reliant on the work of his own calloused hands and the gifts of generous Christians to supply his most basic needs. We would do well to imitate his example of contentment. Paul goes on in 1 Timothy to say, "But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, gentleness. Fight the good fight of the faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called." Those are verses 11 and 12 of chapter 6. This is exactly the reminder we so often need. Don't put your focus on temporary wealth, laying up treasure on earth. Be content with less, and focus instead on laying up eternal treasure in heaven.